We're going to go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce Dr. Saqib Khan, who is our C2M2 Assistant Director, and he will go ahead and introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. This is Saqib. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Connected and Multimodal Mobility. So today we are very delighted to have Dr. Brian Tyler as one of our distinguished speakers. So Dr. Tyler is very well known. So he is the Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs. And also he is the Director of Institute of Transportation Studies at University of California, Los Angeles. He studies travel behavior and transportation equity, finance, history and politics, and his recent research examines many interesting topics like the falling of public transit ridership, socio-economic dimensions of travel behavior, and also the economic effect of traffic congestion. So we are very delighted to have Dr. Tyler here with us, and with this, I would like to hand over to Dr. Tyler, and I would like to request him to start his presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Just want to do a sound check, make sure that everyone can hear me okay. Is that all right?
Yes.
Good. Yeah. Okay, so first what I want to do is offer a short roadmap for this talk, and then I'll move through it. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a big picture look at the causes of and solutions to chronic traffic congestion. So this isn't like I'm not presenting sort of on a single paper. I'm going to refer to several papers that I've worked on over the course of the talk. I'm going to draw on 3 of these papers and two more are in progress. And so I'll note this as I go along. I want to frame traffic congestion as an economic and social issue and not simply a systems problem. I'm assuming that I'm speaking to lots of people in engineering. And so I want to try and offer a different perspective on this fundamental problem. I want to look at the relationships between traffic delays and human activity, because that's really the raison d'etre of the transportation system. It's what we're aiming to do, and I want to look at that a little bit. And finally, at the end, I want to talk a little bit about solutions to congestion, and I want to frame those in economic and political terms, again, rather than in systems terms. So that's what I'm going to try and do. And so it's going to be a bit of a big picture overview of a number of these things. So first I want to start with a question, and that is a congested road system a sign of failure? I think any self-respecting traffic engineer would say, well, of course that's the case. But I'd ask, if you see a long queue at a restaurant or a theater, do you think, oh, that's a terrible restaurant, I wouldn't want to go there, look at all those people there. Or a theater that's packed. And should we look at metropolitan areas any differently? So those that are packed with people with lots of activities and lots of traffic are generating a lot of social and economic activity. And might traffic congestion just be viewed as an inevitable byproduct of a vibrant and successful city? One way we can look is that we know that declining and depressed cities don't typically have a lot of traffic problems. But a larger number and wider variety of social interactions and economic transactions can be consummated in large crowded cities than elsewhere, even with traffic. Now, that leaves us to kind of think of traffic perhaps as a byproduct of success. So then that raises the question, is traffic congestion then an inevitable byproduct of vibrant, successful cities? Well, perhaps, but that's not the same thing as saying the congestion itself is good. I'm not arguing that. But it does mean that the problem of traffic congestion is one that's a problem typically of a place that's succeeding in social and economic terms by other. Of course, that traffic can get so bad it becomes truly debilitating. But I want to think of it in that terms of economic and social systems. So first, I want to suggest that measuring congestion levels is relatively easy. Measuring congestion costs is relatively hard. And the way we typically do it is sort of one side of the ledger and not both sides. So we know that perceptions of delay vary from person to person, from firm to firm, and from trip to trip. So my value of time when I travel varies wildly. When I'm rushing to the airport to make a flight that I might have done to come give this talk in person a year ago, and when I take my dogs to the beach on the weekend, when I'm really in no hurry at all and enjoy the drive. So my value of time varies dramatically, and yet we treat the cost of congestion as being somewhat uniform. Typically, we do things like take half the wage rate and estimate time spent in traffic or additional time spent in traffic and multiply that by half the wage rate. And we get figures like this from the Texas Transportation Institute at the University of Texas A&M University, where they've estimated $179 billion in traffic costs associated with delay in 494 urban areas. And as you can see, those traffic costs have been going up over time in small, medium, large, and very large metropolitan areas. And they're highest and the costs are greatest in the very biggest areas. So given these high costs, why hasn't there been an exodus from large cities since 1982? If it's so unbearably expensive and debilitating to be in congestion, why haven't people been leaving and going to other places? So this kind of presents a little bit of a paradox when we think about those congestion costs. So if you look at this lists the 7 metropolitan areas with the most annual hours of traffic delay for commuters, according to TTI. And that's San Francisco, Oakland, New York, Newark, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, where I am right now, Boston, San Jose, and Seattle. And I've also put up here the gross regional product rank, so the amount of economic output in that, that metropolitan area. And in the case of San Jose and San Francisco, it's really splitting one area into 2, so it's 2 different MSAs. And then also the gross regional product per capita. So that's the amount of wealth created per person. So it adjusts for population. And as you can see, the relationship between high levels of traffic and high levels of both gross regional product and regional product per capita are quite close. So in other words, the places that are most traffic congested, that are presumably generating most of the costs that TTI is talking about, also happen to be the most economically productive regions in the country, and even on a per capita basis. So it starts to raise the question, well, what are these costs and how do we net them out against what we might see as larger sort of economic production in a region? So if there's so much income generation in the most congested and expensive areas, why is that? Well, let me offer a little theory about sort of this idea of proximity and congestion. First is that agglomerations or clusters of linked firms are considered by regional economists as central to economic performance. In many ways, they're why cities exist. Firms reduce the cost of accessing industry-specific workers, knowledge, and suppliers. And the transportation network directly affects the access to those workers and suppliers. So the transportation network should be an economic a drag on economic interactions and social interactions and economic transactions. But we also know at the same time that the agglomerations are pushing those various activities together. So we have to net out those access costs in some way. And typically that isn't done in transportation analyses. So first, I'm going to refer to a paper down here at the bottom we had come out a couple of years ago, and this is with 3 former students. When we ask the question that when firms locate or relocate, do they seek to avoid congestion? So we examined whether local area congestion affected the location and the number of startups in basic or tradable industries in Los Angeles or San Francisco Bay Area. And what that means is these are industries that essentially export their product to other regions. So you might think of movies and television shows in Los Angeles, or you can think of iPhones and tablets in the San Francisco Bay Area. These are things unlike the local sandwich shop or gas station where product is being consumed outside the region, or in the case of tourism, it's bringing money from outside into the region. So we looked at 5 key industries, and then we used one as a control. So we looked at advertising, apparel, manufacturing, entertainment, information technologies, and securities and commodities. And we also use grocery stores, which we wouldn't assume are importers. And we did this for both the Bay Area and LA. We ended up, the paper I referred to talks about specifically the Bay Area, but we did the analysis for both Southern California and Northern California. And so what we did is we used sort of a standard methodology to estimate firm startups. This just gives the model form. And what we did is we tested the standard control variables thought to affect the location of new firms, which had to do with the population and firm-specific employment in a particular sector, the degree of concentration, a variety of other factors. But we also added congestion to this, and we looked at local area congestion within a traffic analysis zone, within adjacent zones, and then we used a gravity-based measure to try and adjust for overall traffic around the region. Overall, we found little evidence that traffic was pushing new firms to less congested parts of LA or the San Francisco Bay Area. We weren't able to see whether firms located in other regions. We just looked at those regions. And in fact, in many of the model specifications, it was just the opposite. So after we controlled for the array of factors known to influence firm location, new tradable industry firms were often more likely to start up in heavily congested areas, which would imply that they were attracted to the congestion and not repelled by it. Well, it's not the traffic congestion that we think that they're attracted to, but it was the economic advantages of agglomeration, and that was outweighing the added costs of these delays. So the agglomeration itself generates local area congestion, but that agglomeration also generates benefit of having a high level of access to other firms. So in spite of the congestion delays, firms were attracted to these concentrations of activities. And it may be that these tradable industries firms are influenced by congestion, but by depending even more on clustering. So if you can imagine, you have an agglomeration of economic activity, and many firms located in that area, and it generates local area traffic congestion, then being in the agglomeration can be even more important, because now you have quick access, even if it's via congested streets, to nearby firms, networks of firms, knowledge networks, and all of that might actually work to increase the concentration of activity even more, which of course then generates additional traffic congestion. So we can think of this as the mobility proximity trade-off, that there are benefits to crowding things together, even if it slows things down, but there are also benefits to being able to move quickly and easily between origins and destinations, which often requires spreading them out. So we can think of this as sort of an important thing that transportation scholars and economic analysts should be analyzing, but it's actually been studied relatively little. We look a lot at agglomerations and economic analysis. We look a lot at mobility and transportation, but rarely do we try and net those out and look at them together. It should be super important for planning and policy. For example, a new office building should increase local job access. Oops, sorry. But the added traffic delays may net out and actually reduce traffic job access. So if you can imagine, if we put a new office building in an already congested area and we slow traffic to a crawl, it could be that access to the jobs in that building go up, but it also could be that we've so diminished the functioning of the transportation system that we've actually made things worse off as a result. And it would be pretty important to be able to figure out when and under what circumstances adding development to an agglomeration that already has traffic congestion increases accessibility or decreases it. And of course, we'd have to think about the mobility side as well. So traffic impact analyses, which is sort of standard traffic engineering practice for most local governments, only focuses on one side of that equation. It looks at how that new office building or the new housing development is going to affect level of service typically at intersections that are adjacent to the new development. And it finds if they degrade them below a certain level, the project needs to be modified, the developer needs to pay for improvements, typically capacity expansions, or that risks not being approved at all. So but we never ask whether the actual access for people who live and work in the area will be increased or decreased by that new development. So ideally, we'd want to consider those net effects, and we'd want to find tools that allow us to look at proximity and mobility and figure out whether there's an increase or decrease. So if our goal is to maximize access, the question is, are we better off cramming a lot of destinations together and engendering increased vehicle delays? Or should we focus on allowing people to travel speedily and reliably across a broad swath of destinations, in which case we try and spread things out as much as possible? So to answer those questions, this is a second paper that this group of students worked on. We tried to work on netting this out, and again, we used the Bay Area. We asked, what are the relative sizes and effects of speed and proximity on access? And do these effect sizes vary from place to place within a region? So here's a look at LA, and this just gives you a density of employment within the region. For those of you not familiar with Los Angeles, to the left, the area, the bottom of the left, that white, that's the Pacific Ocean. The light green that you see are national forests. The top right is mostly desert areas, and the bottom right is mountains and desert as well. So the basin of Los Angeles, the region has about 19 million people, and the basin itself about 12 or 13 million people. That's the area in the center of the map. And you can see even within that, concentrations. You see downtown LA there in an arc that goes towards Santa Monica. That's the largest concentration of development, and UCLA is in that as well. That to the north where Burbank is, that's a lot of studio activity. That's the San Fernando Valley. And then down to the right is what's called Orange County. And you can see Santa Ana and UC Irvine is near there, another concentration of activity. So this is another way of just generating that. And what that says is from any given census tract, how many, and we used a gravity model for this, so it's a gravity weighted measure of access time, is there to another job in the area. So this is where you would live. The redder it is, the more jobs you have access to it. The bluer it is, the less access to jobs you have. That's just looking at proximity. It's not measuring any travel time. This looks at average travel speed in the region. And you should notice something right away, is that the concentration of employment in this case is almost perfectly inverse. And the large white there, those are forest areas with virtually no activity in them. Is close to the inverse of what we see in the region, so that the dark blue are very slow travel speeds, the bright red are high travel speeds. So in outlying area, not surprising, can move around quite quickly, and toward the center they can. Well, we can put those together, and what we can do is look at average peak hour travel speeds. Load that on, and for each person living within each census tract in the region, we can estimate their relative access to employment in every other census tract based on average levels of delay. And lo and behold, we find that once we control for travel speeds, that the map looks much more like just the straight proximity map on the top left, and not very much at all like the travel speed map on the top right. And in fact, our models will bear this out. That it's actually, if we think about in a conceptual way that's pretty simple, is to say, what's the average travel time to the average job? The average travel time to the average job in that bottom is the lowest in those red areas where the traffic speeds are actually the lowest, meaning that you don't have to travel very far, but you travel at a slow speed. This is another way of doing that. We came up with a job accessibility. That's a gravity model weighted measure on the y-axis, and then the actual number of jobs within 10 kilometers. And again, you realize that Los Angeles is a very huge area, right? So we're talking about, there are places where there's up to 1 million jobs within 6.2 miles. Then on and it shows a pretty clear relationship that as job access goes up, so does the distance to another job. So in other words, it's much more important to be centrally located than out in the periphery. On the right, it's the same job access, but now we have the average speed, and you see indeed the inverse relationship, where the faster you go, on average, the longer travel time you have to get to a job within the region. And if you see those dots, those are individual tracks. The ones that go up over about 40 kilometers per hour are, that's downtown Los Angeles, just to give you an idea of that. Then we put the two together, And here we have the jobs on the x-axis and the average speed on the y-axis, and the color represents the access to jobs. So again, as speeds go down, job access goes up. So this is just the opposite of what we would be, any self-respecting traffic analyst would think would be the case. So to put this in a simple term, we just have we estimated there are three real simple models here for the sake of the argument. First just looks at peak hour speed scaled, and the second one looks at the employment proximity scaled. And then we look at that employment accessibility, which is that, that gravity model weighted peak hour access score. We see in a first model where all we have in is speed, we find that we have indeed a negative relationship. So it tells us that if we only look at travel speed, that access to employment goes up as speed goes down, which is extremely counterintuitive, but for the reasons I've explained, it should make sense. If we move now here just to look at proximity, we can see we have a much more predictive model, and we get the relationship we'd expect. That is a positive coefficient on this effect, which says that that proximity is a strong predictor of overall access. Then when we put it together, we actually see that the sign flips on speed in a way that we'd understand. So saying that proximity still remains extremely important, the model is similarly predictive, but now we get what would be a sensible relationship. That is that controlling for employment proximity, being able to travel faster increases access. So this suggests that proximity is doing the heavy lifting in determining job access in and around the LA region as a total. And I mentioned we did this for the Bay Area and we got very similar results. But what happens within communities? So we can look at that. This is that similar sort of relationship I showed you before. But now what we've done is color code actual tracks in four different areas. The first, the green at the top, is downtown LA. The second is Santa Ana, which is that Orange County cluster of employment. The third is Compton, which is a largely Black and Latino inner ring suburb south of downtown Los Angeles. I'll show you that a bit later. And the fourth is Palmdale, which is out in the desert fringe, out on the exurban edge. You'll notice that the slope of all of these is in the direction we'd expect. That is that within one of these clusters, higher speeds are associated with higher access to employment. So it should give us a little bit of comfort that the world isn't turned upside down, that within this, if we manage to reduce congestion, we actually can increase access even more. But again, the heavy lifting is done by all of that proximity, that cramming those things together. And you can see how much higher downtown is in terms of job access, or Santa Ana is, than Palmdale down in the bottom right, out on the desert fringe. So in a nutshell, between communities, agglomeration more than outweighs congestion in determining access to employment. But within communities, less congestion is better in explaining access. And just as any angry local resident at a public hearing could tell you, and I want to talk about that in just a second. So am I trying to argue that people who focus on congestion and congestion mitigation are misguided? No, not so fast. The speed differentials do matter substantially in some areas. And there's a big difference between aggregate access and access to a specific destination. And this goes a lot to the politics of congestion. So from the perspective of those opposed to a high density office or housing development in their neighborhood, and almost any neighborhood will oppose that kind of a project, this is kind of how they would frame it. So if I live in this neighborhood and I'm settled in my job and where I grocery shop and where my kids go to school, what do I care that a new office building, a new grocery store, a new school will increase metropolitan access overall if it increases traffic delays for me in the process? Now that logic is sound, but it may result in individually rational perceptions leading to collectively irrational outcomes. It may say we need to put development out on the fringe because it'll have less of a traffic impact, but we may be actually reducing access and increasing total vehicle travel in the process. So in other words, imposing new development in an already built up congested area may make me better off, but it may well retard economic growth and overall metropolitan access in the process. So I live in West LA in a single family dwelling, but in a densely developed area. And Google is converting a mall near me into their Southern California headquarters. And it's expected to, pre-pandemic, have a huge increase in employment there. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on the housing stock in the area. So the city is planning to build along the major boulevards to rezone to allow for 2 to 4 stories of residential above the ground floor retail. And the neighbors here are all organizing to oppose it. Okay, so it's that logic right there. Even though that may make a lot of sense to build more housing around this new employment development, the neighbors are going to oppose it. And this logic may be the opposite in outside areas where we put stuff in outlying areas and we may actually not be increasing access. So next, I want to ask this question. If we're going to measure congestion costs in cities, should we be considering isolation costs as well? This is a picture of a highway on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, and I was just out there recently. So I want to give you an example of my access to the nearest medical center that specializes in the treatment of Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. And I mention that because 2 of my good friends are co-directors of the center. And it's sort of internationally recognized as one of the leading places that for someone with this terrible disease to be treated. And what I can tell you is that access from my house, I'm down there near that park on the bottom right, is about 10 minutes in the off-peak, but up to 22 minutes in the peak as the congestion gets very heavy on the streets in West Los Angeles. Okay, so my limitations are quite significant during the peak hour. Now, I checked with my friends and I asked them where they draw their patients from, and it turns out that the nearest medical center specializing in the treatment of Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy from the Navajo Nation in New Mexico is the UCLA Medical Center. And their isolation is the issue. So they have no congestion out on the reservation, but to get to those kind of specialized services, they have a long way off. So we often will count these congestion costs, but we don't count isolation costs and access either. And that raises a big question about what happens, how we measure high function with no congestion. So then it raises the question of how does congestion and access interplay with activity participation? So one of the arguments about what we're doing in transportation is we enable activities to occur. This is the logic of providing access. We allow firms to move goods around. We allow workers to get to jobs, people to get to medical centers, to see friends, to buy groceries. They engage in activities, and in general, if proximity increases access more than mobility in metropolitan areas, how do access and mobility relate to trip making? And trip making can be a substitute for activity participation because someone goes to the grocery store in order to shop, they go to a job in order to work, they go to the doctor in order to be cared for. So let's try a thought experiment. How would job access change if we could eliminate congestion entirely? What would happen? Well, it certainly seems great. Now you all in Clemson don't deal with this as much, but if you're in Atlanta, if you're in Washington, D.C., you're dealing with heavy congestion in the center, how much would things change? Well, we looked at this in the Bay Area. And what we did is look at, on the right, what would be job access for all of the people living in the range. And again, we estimated gravity functions for this. Every job within the region. And what we did is measure that level of access. On the left is that same access to jobs during the peak hour. And we used both, we accounted for both transit and highways. Then we on the left, we divided those into 10 sort of bins, 10, 0 to 10th percentile, 10th to 19th, 20th to 29th, and so on. And what we have is the red is the highest levels of job access, and then the bottom, that's Silicon Valley, and the top it's San Francisco. And blue is lower levels of job access. So what we can see, again, is those central areas have high levels of access. And on the right, that's what happens if we were able to completely eliminate all congestion on the transportation network. We'd have higher levels of job access, and you can see things moving. But what happened is that Some people might go up 1% decile bin, a few people 2, and one place in the region 3. But for the most part, and especially in the areas where the most jobs are, there isn't as much change. Where do we see the most change? For those of you familiar with the Bay Area, the salmon color are where you would get the biggest benefit of increases in job access. Those are mostly bedroom suburbs of the Bay Area. The jobs are, again, on the lower left, and up in San Francisco and Oakland on the upper left. Almost all of those salmon-colored areas are in places with low numbers of jobs and lots of houses. So people are traveling on congested freeways to get to work. So the effect is actually shockingly small, given that most of the region would have relatively little change in completely eliminating congestion. So that's the second paper. And the third one is to say, okay, well, that's jobs and firms, but what about people? How does access relate to household activities? Again, always thinking about congestion in this. This is a third one also with my former student, Andrew Monshine, who's at the University of Virginia. We know that activity participation is positively associated with income, and what I've learned from Professor Morris to life satisfaction, that trip making is highly correlated with activity participation. So how do access, mobility, and traffic relate to trip making? In general, we should assume that if you have a lot more traffic, you can't engage in as many activities because you have to spend more time traveling to them. So we, from this paper, came up with an idea we thought of as about kind of good congestion and bad congestion. And I want to try and explain an example of that. So we think about New York, it's surely one of the most congested cities in the country. This is a view from my sister's apartment building across the 72nd Street Broadway station in Upper West Side. People have a lot of choices. They can certainly drive a car, they can take a cab, Uber and Lyft, they can take the subway, they can take buses, and it's also easy to walk to lots of destinations. Houston is very different, right? It's a very big city. They have a relatively good transit system there, but it's an environment that's very difficult to make it work effectively, and you have high levels of congestion in Houston. We can think in New York, you can walk, bike, bus, subway, taxi, drive. In Houston, drive, and many other options are typically much slower, including transit. So what about LA and San Francisco? Well, we suggested that some parts of the region are New York-like and others are Houston-like. So here's another map that just gives you a look again at the level of congestion delays for each of these. I think they're 100-meter pixels in the region, in the peak hour, and then the freeways give you an average level of delay as well. So you can see these concentrations of congestion in a few areas. I sometimes ask my students what they think this is. They look at it and they'll say right away, oh, well, red is high poverty areas and green is not. If you look at it, it doesn't quite match up. It's actually average rates of trip making in the neighborhood. So after you control for a variety of social and demographic factors, what's the residual level of trip making? And what we can see is it actually tends to be lower in some neighborhoods. We identified in this neighborhoods where people were making more trips than would be expected, and they tended to be relatively short trips. And also neighborhoods with red where people made fewer trips than we expect, and they also tended to be longer trips. So we can think of some neighborhoods as being places that support lots of relatively short trips and others that require fewer and longer trips. Now, we also estimated some models for this, and after controlling for socioeconomic and household characteristics known to influence trip making, we asked, what are the independent effects of average trip distance and local congestion on trip making? And again, our theory is that congestion should depress the overall number of trips made. Now, if I could see you all, I would say, well, what do you suppose we found? Well, the model we estimated for the region gave us somewhat murky results. We then split it and tried to look at those areas in outlying areas and in central areas, and this is what we saw. So for those people who lived in mostly outlying low density areas, what we might think of as the suburbs, we found that trip distance is negatively associated with trip making. That is, and it should make intuitive sense, that people who are making very long trips have less time available in the day to make more trips, right? So that they're making fewer trips as a result of long trips. And this might be, think of people living out on the suburban fringe who have a long commute into the city to go to work. We found that local congestion is negatively associated with trip making. So in outlying suburbs, if you have a lot of congestion out there, people make less trips than we would otherwise expect. And we can assume that this is related to the delays of local congestion. So this fits with traditional thinking entirely. We found that whether people drive or travel by other means, it had no effect on overall trip making. And we found that whether people made walking trips or not had no effect on overall trip making. Again, these results mostly confirm conventional wisdom. Okay, now what happens when we looked at those people living in mostly central high activity density areas? Okay, so we've got higher density. What happens? Trip distance is also negatively associated with trip making. That's what we found before. So we got the same thing. People making longer trips tend to make fewer of them. However, unlike the suburbs, congestion has no effect on trip making in these central areas. And these are the most congested areas. So how is that possible? How is it possible that heavy levels of congestion are not depressing trip making? We find that actually when people drive to destinations in these central areas, that's associated with making fewer trips. But walking is associated with making more trips. So you have a very different picture in these built up areas where people are walking to more trips, and actually when they walk to destinations, they're more likely to make more trips in that congested area. And obviously the traffic congestion is probably having little effect on walking. However, the development that engenders that congestion pushes things together so that there are more destinations within walking distance. So these results run counter to conventional wisdom in the logic of traffic impact analyses. So traffic impact analysis would say, hey, we don't want to put another apartment building in this area because it's going to make traffic worse. But according to our analysis, the traffic level is not going to have any effect on the trip making. And if it makes it easier for people to walk to destinations, we may even see more activity occur within that area. So a very different sort of intellectual framework for how we think about the effect of traffic on activity. So what about LA? Places like West Hollywood have high densities and closely mixed uses. It causes lots of congestion, but it makes it easy to walk and take transit to nearby destinations. So there's West Hollywood, and indeed, that's one of those neighborhoods with many short trips. South of downtown, we see moderate densities and less compatible land use also causes lots of congestion, but with few nearby destinations accessible by foot, bike, or bus, we see less trip making. And indeed, this is, again, controlling for socioeconomic factors. So we see people making fewer trips, and they tend to be longer in those kinds of destinations. So what does all of this tell us? Should we just learn to love congestion? Should we just get along? Well, no, I'm not going to say that. Just because places can thrive economically and culturally in spite of congestion does not mean that we as transportation planners and engineers shouldn't try to do a better job of managing traffic. We should, and I'd argue we can, but what we can't say is that the development that causes the congestion is necessarily the problem, and too often we do. So let me offer another Southern California example. So development in the greater LA region varies substantially. And unlike, and I used to live in North Carolina, where the terrain looks so similar everywhere you go, it varies enormously in the West. This is actually in the Southern California Association of Governments planning region. And so is this. This is downtown Los Angeles. So we have enormous variations in development patterns. The land uses vary, the development densities vary, the price of land varies a lot. And this is to be expected. So what I showed you in that first aerial, that's north shore of Salton Sea, near, for those of you who are into music, we're near where the Coachella Music Festival is held each year. Single family homes there sell for roughly $100 per square foot. Not the astronomical housing prices that someone would associate with Los Angeles. In Beverly Hills in 90210, single family homes there sell for roughly $1,000 a square foot. Okay, so a pretty big difference in terms of the two neighborhoods and their average selling price. And of course, if we look at the actual cost of the land beneath these houses, you'll see that most of the difference in the cost is due to the difference in prices of land and only some of it due to the difference of the cost of the structure. But the price of driving in these two places does not vary at all. This is Highway 111 that goes through North Shore Salton Sea, and that's what it looks like much of the time. And this is the 405 freeway in West Los Angeles, and that's what it looks like much of the time. So road space is abundant in one place and scarce in the other. But while the price of land underneath the roads varies by a factor of 10, the price to access those roads is generally 0 in both places. So let's do yet one more thought experience. I want you to imagine a world where electricity is bundled into annual property tax levies. So no matter how much or how little electricity one uses, the tax paid is the same. And the overall tax rises and lowers based on overall levels of consumption. There would be no incentive for any individual to use electricity judiciously. Shortages would be chronic. We'd probably have brownouts and rolling blackouts every weekday morning and afternoon in many areas. There'd be campaigns to encourage people to use more candles. And we'd accept this as the natural state of affairs. It's part of life in the big city, we'd say. And we might either fret that we don't have enough funding to build more power plants, or we'd lament that more people weren't adopting electricity light lifestyles. What's wrong with them? They're just addicted to their electricity. Some might suggest, well, why don't we meter electricity to encourage more judicious use? So everyone will have an electric meter and they'll pay for how much they use. But most people would dismiss this as unrealistic. People need electricity, they'd say, and they really can't conserve. Or it might hurt poor people. So because it could hurt poor people, we have no choice but to give electricity away to everyone, rich and poor, for free. Welcome to our world. This is the logic that we have in how we administer transportation systems in big urban areas. When we give valuable things away for free, like scarce road space in densely developed cities, the demand for them regularly exceeds the supply and shortages result. So that's where so many transportation economists argue about pricing. What if we brought the supply and demand for road space into equilibrium with prices? The time cost of travel would decline, but the price of driving would increase. Driving would become easier and faster, but more expensive in the process. And this is one thing, some pricing advocates here in California say, oh yes, we need pricing to make driving an awful experience. It shouldn't make it an awful experience. It should make it a fabulous experience, because you could drive to almost any destination congestion free. You just have to pay a lot when you wanted to do it at a time when many other people did as well. Congestion delays wouldn't return because driving got easier and faster, but it didn't get cheaper. And most other improvements we make when we make driving easier and faster, we also encourage more of it, and why we have so much trouble getting a handle around congestion. So this promise of pricing, I think there's one thing to note. When we allow everyone in cities to crowd onto any road they want, anytime they want, we all pay for this with time spent sitting in traffic. That's what brings things into equilibrium. But no one gets any revenue for all this time spent in congestion. We pay in time, but no one gets revenue. When drivers pay a price to move freely where road space is scarce, these payments produce revenues. That revenues can be used to increase road capacity, to improve alternatives to driving, to assist low-income travelers, and the like. So what do we do about all that vibrancy-caused congestion? Can we do selective road capacity enhancements, parking and road pricing to manage demand, invest in alternative travel modes in built-up areas? Check, check, check. We can do all of those things. But should development proposals in already built-up congested areas be categorically rejected because they will exacerbate traffic, which is what so happens in areas now, even if they make residents really angry? Not so fast. We might want to reconsider that. So thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors. Andrew Monshine is that's his assistant. I wrote that wrong. He's now an associate professor of urban planning at the University of Virginia. Tanner Osmond is a postdoctoral scholar at the Lewis Center. Trevor Thomas was a former PhD student in our program. And I'm working now on this with Hao Ding and Fariba Sadiq, who are both urban planning PhD students at UCLA. Okay, so moderator, we can then turn to questions and discussion.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. If you have any questions, feel free. You can unmute yourself and just ask them directly, or you can put them in the chat and I am happy to read them out. So, yes, Dr. Morris. Hi.
I have a couple of questions. Thanks so much, Professor Taylor. Two things. So first of all, since you have this great data set, did you try to do, or do you know of others who have tried to do hedonic analysis of job accessibility and how it relates to property prices? I mean, it seems just from eyeballing your results that there's a strong link between accessibility and property prices, although that may be due to other things as well besides job accessibility. And then my second question is, how does this all relate to the pandemic and what's going on now, but especially what might be going on in the future world if some of the changes in the location of jobs and the amount of congestion permanently change as a result?
So the first question, so among the co-authors you saw was Tanner Osmond, who ended up, we started collaborating. He worked with Michael Storper, who's a regional economist of some note in our program, and has continued to work in this area. And I know he's working on a paper now where he's trying to incorporate traffic and access measures into some of the traditional models that the regional economists use. So I don't know of any paper who have tried to do those into the housing, the hedonic model for the price of housing. He's focused more on jobs, but that's an interesting suggestion. That's a really interesting idea. With respect to the pandemic, I'm not surprised to get that question. I think that there's a whole lot of speculation going on now about the nature of the agglomeration economies moving forward. I think, and conversations that the two of us have had in the past, is that many people who have a long publication records that find again and again sort of the power of these local agglomeration economies are to me surprisingly unspecific about what is it about concentrating activity that really brings about higher levels of productivity. They talk about face-to-face interactions. They talk about incidental meeting and activity. They talk about sort of these knowledge spillovers where you just have an environment where people who are working and socializing are able to share information in a way that others can't get it. But I found it a little unsatisfying, and I'd say one of the things that has been a curiosity is why when information and telecommunication continues to improve and the costs of electronic access continue to go down, and why when we now have sort of globally distant production and supply and distribution chains, should agglomeration still be such a powerful force? And some are arguing right now that the pandemic is going to shake loose this this residual strength that agglomeration has had, because now finally people have been, I'm giving this talk, I would have flown to South Carolina, it would have taken several days and hours on a flight. Also, I'd be there in person. And some are arguing that we forced experiment to see that we can have high levels of economic productivity and not necessarily be all concentrated in the same place. And certainly firms are assuming that there's going to be more work from home, whether it's 100% or whether people start to split their time between home and office, that's likely to increase. So the question will be, will we continue to have the pressures of these agglomerations? That's on the job side. On the housing side, we've also seen a lot of attraction to living in more central areas, lots of higher density housing and demand for that. There's been an argument that for those who favor that kind of housing with lots of things to walk to, there's less choice and less supply than for single family dwellings. The pandemic right now appears to also be turning that on its head, where the markets in high density areas are softer now than for more housing in outlying areas. The question is to what extent will these trends persist post-pandemic? I think anyone who tries to say they know for sure is misleading you. But I think that we're likely to see some weakening of the pressure on these agglomerations, but something has been keeping these going for longer than many transportation analysts have been speculating. But we've seen that there would be predictions over the course of my career. We saw more predictions of more working from home than we've seen. We've now seen a huge jump from that. It may be that jolt kind of continues in the future. However, so those are all reasons why we might have less concentrations of activity and less traffic. However, we certainly see, and I'm doing work on public transit right now in the pandemic, is that there's more reluctance to participate in shared modes, at least over the short term. And looking at previous epidemics, people are somewhat cautious about returning to shared modes. So that might imply more driving, more single occupant vehicle travel. So we may have diminished concentrations of activity, but we might be generating similar levels of vehicle traffic to and from them. So we might continue to have congestion in those levels. So I think right now, we shouldn't get too caught up in how dramatic the changes are for these effects. It seems to me unlikely that the pandemic, as dramatic as it is going to have dramatic downturns in congestion over the long run. We certainly see it returning with a vengeance here in Los Angeles, and I suspect in many other big cities as well.
Thanks.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? And like I said, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, ma'am. Do you want video?
Sure.
That's entirely up to you.
Never mind. Okay, I'll just ask the question regardless. So earlier you had mentioned that people will often reject development that may increase access to jobs because it will negatively impact their own life experience, mainly congestion related. And that it seems like everybody is going to do this almost automatically. So then the development which benefits everybody, and it doesn't get built because it doesn't benefit any one person individually. This seems a lot like the three prisoners problem, or not the three prisoners problem, the prisoner's dilemma. So a problem from game theory. And in that problem, the equilibrium state is that the two prisoners will defect against each other rather than help each other out to improve their life. Do you have a solution that could allow us to reach that optimum state, even though no one person actually wants to take the initiative to do it, to vote yes?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a you're right, it's a dilemma. I'm not sure if it's the prisoner's dilemma, but no, there's winners and losers. The winners are people who can then say, let's take the example of an apartment building in my area that my neighbors are opposing. The winners of those are the losers are those people who could move into that apartment building and now can't, and have to live pay higher prices and live distant. So we have an extreme shortage of housing in Southern California. That shortage of housing is making landowners like me rich and renters poor and poor, so that there's this increasing gap. And there's an interest in homeowners in limiting the supply. There's an interest in medical doctors limiting the supply of medical doctors. There's a lot of, you can think of it as more cartel-like behavior. My neighbor, so I have a job, so improved job access, the new Google Southern California headquarters, I'm not going to work there. I'm unlikely to work there. So it doesn't affect me personally, but it does affect many people within the region. In this case, what we have is the people who show up at public hearings are the people who have something to lose. The people who do not show up are the people who have something to gain because they don't know those gains yet. They have not realized those gains. And that's the real fundamental dilemma we have, because we have, in general, people tend to be risk averse. And because they're risk averse, as a planner, I can say, wow, more people living in here, the fabric shop is going to be replaced by a cafe, and there'll be a lot more active things that'll make it much more interesting for me to walk to. I'll really enjoy it a lot. But for most people, what they see is they're happy in the place they have now, and they want to discourage change. So I think that community participation often tends to be very conservative, not in a Democrat-Republican way, but in a way of wanting to inhibit change because of people's natural risk aversion. So the dilemma is that the losers are renters in Southern California. The losers are people who would like to live across the street from the new Google headquarters and be able to walk to it and then walk to other shops and restaurants around here, but won't be able to if the neighbors succeed in stopping this new project. So that's the problem we have a lot. And in fact, it's a problem generally in planning. It's why we need to have a sewage treatment plant. Where we put it is a difficult thing. That's an easier because it obviously generates negative externalities around the plant. But in this case, it's not necessarily clear that the people living in the neighborhood will ultimately be worse off. They may now be able to walk to lots of restaurants rather than drive to them. But right now they drive to them. And what they can say is, now I drive to a restaurant a few miles away. I don't know whether a restaurant will be built a few blocks away from me, but I know if those apartments are built, traffic will get worse and it'll be harder to me to drive to my favorite restaurant 3 miles away. So because of that risk aversion on one hand, and the fact that the winners are the potential winners and the current losers are people, it's very indistinct. People don't show up at a public hearing and say, yes, build this project because I might conceivably live here one day. That's not who shows up to public hearings. And so our process is built in to, I think, favor, make it difficult to create these agglomerations that are so associated with high levels of economic productivity.
So how do you make up for the lack of participation among the proposed beneficiaries?
Well, there's one view that's what professional planners and engineers are there for, is to consider the broader needs of the community and not just the loudest voices at public hearings. I think in general, what we've done is to say, well, let's see if we can get more people at those public hearings to have their voices heard too. But there's also an idea so I think in Canada, the model is much more that planners say, hey, we need to build more housing. We're going to build more housing even if the people in the neighborhood are unhappy about it. That's not typically how it plays out in the US, which is why we tend to have lots of development at the fringe, generating lots of vehicle traffic, which ultimately increases VMT a lot, but doesn't necessarily increase access.
Do you believe there's a way to do that without sacrificing democracy or democratic means?
Well, public participation at a meeting is not democratic. People show up and shout at a meeting. I have my neighborhood association. People go and they say, I represent this neighborhood and we're against that. And I don't agree with it. They claim to speak for me. So in a sense, it's sort of a representative model. But we tend to give a lot of weight to the loudest voices, and we don't, it's not as though everyone has been sort of explained what are the pros and cons of this approach and asked to weigh in on it. It's who has time to show up to public meetings, and the people who have time are people who are retired or don't have to be, reading to their kids at night and busy with other things. And so we don't tend to get sort of uniform participation within organizations like this in general. So I'm not sure I'd describe it as, it is participatory, but I'm not sure it's democratic.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. And do we have any other questions?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was looking forward to my visit to South Carolina, and that'll have to happen again at some other time. Or maybe we'll just become so used to this that we won't do the in-person things anymore, and we'll all do them remotely. But I appreciate the invitation, and I am glad to have had a chance to speak with you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. We do appreciate your flexibility. As with all our webinars, this will be posted on our social media. It'll be on our YouTube and our website. And if you have any questions for Dr. Taylor, feel free to reach out to me. I can forward them on, or to the center. We can certainly put you in contact. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thanks.